online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 1, I'm Emily Rose Adams. Lateral flows and PCRs are unavailable in England as pharmacies blame the inconsistent supply chain. Warnings from the Prime Minister that up to 90% of COVID patients in intensive care have not been boosted. And 7 pro-democracy journalists are arrested in Hong Kong, accused of inciting hate against the authorities. Pharmacists are calling for urgent action to improve the supply of COVID tests as lateral flow home deliveries and PCR appointments become unavailable across the whole of England. Chemists are also having to turn people away empty-handed due to what they're calling low and inconsistent supplies. Yesterday, a record 117,000 cases were recorded in England. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says up to 90% of people who are in intensive care with COVID are not yet boosted. Boris Johnson said there are 2.4 million eligible double-jabbed people yet to take up the offer of a third dose and praised those who have had their third jab.
We've done about 32.5, maybe more, million booster jabs now. And that is allowing us to go ahead with New Year in the cautious way that we are.
A report is warning teenagers taken into care to be safeguarded from exploitation are being put at more serious risk by the care system itself. The Commission on Young Lives said the system is handing children over to criminal gangs and added that it's unfit for purpose. And a pro-democracy news website in Hong Kong has announced it's shutting down after senior staff were arrested. 7 journalists from the independent website Stand News are being accused of publishing articles inciting hate against the authorities. And that's your live news on Talk Radio TV. We'll have more in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Standing up, speaking out.
Richard Tice.
Powered by debate.
Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Richard Tice.
A man of impeccable pedigree. Richard Tice. Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome and a very good afternoon to Tice Talk here on Wednesday the 29th of December. I'm standing in for the next 3 hours for Ian Collins. It's a great honour and privilege to do so, and I hope the weather is a little bit better with you than here in central London, where it is grey, it is overcast, it is gloomy. But actually I don't think that's the mood of what seems to be happening at the moment, in particular with COVID. Now, I've only just got over being a little bit grumpy this morning as Liverpool lost last night to Leicester, but I think I'm over it now. And I am encouraged by the data and the mood and the tone of the conversations on COVID, and we're going to be talking about that throughout the show. We're also going to be talking about 2022, the year of the squeeze financially. The sort of bills that are going to be coming through is significant. We're going to be reviewing that. We've got some amazing guests. We've got MEPs, we've got guests from South Africa to talk about Omicron, what's going on down there. And my question to you, I've actually got 2 questions. When do you think, if ever, Plan B restrictions will be lifted, which I believe they should be? And are you with me? Do you think we're now well over the worst of COVID and we've got to look forwards, we've got to learn to live with it? Do you think we're over the worst, or have you still got some niggling fears out there? So call me, text me, tweet me, you know the number, 0344 499 1000, text 87222 using the word talk, or tweet at Talk Radio. And don't forget, you can watch us live, download the app, or watch us on YouTube via the website, Apple TV, Samsung, Rakuten, a whole range of ways. There's no excuse not to watch if you can. Stay with me. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
Well, we need to talk about the good news emerging day by day around COVID. And is this actually moving away from being a crisis into something, just another thing that we learn to live with it? I've got a strong feeling that the crisis, we're way past the worst. We're on the downslope now. I don't know how long that will be, but I'm bravely, I hope not going to regret this, I'm calling it. We're past the worst. And actually 2022 is going to be a year of facing different challenges. All of the key data is in the right directions. And for me, the absolute key data are the number of people in ICU and the number of sad deaths. And both of those metrics are either flat or falling on a 7-day basis. So that is good news. And that's why I'm slightly surprised that the Prime Minister is still semi-scaremongering by continually referring to cases. I mean, call me and tell me anecdotally people you know who've had COVID, Omicron in the last few days. But I know a number of people, and actually their symptoms have been really relatively mild. But let me know your symptoms, 0344 499 1000. And isn't it interesting to hear the change in tone from some of the experts, the scientists, the SAGE members? For example, Sir John Bell from the government vaccine task force, he said that people are spending less time in hospital. They don't need full amounts of oxygen. The average stay now in hospital is around 3 days. It was much, much more than that, sort of 7 to 10 days. And in a sense, he said that actually the days of those horror times of mass deaths are history. That's very significant. And then Professor Paul Hunter from the University of East Anglia, he said this disease is not going away. Well, we know that. The infection is not going away, so we have to learn to live with it, don't we? He then went on to say, but we're not going to see it as severe for much longer. And ultimately, and this is the key thing, ultimately he said, we're going to have to let people go about normal lives as if they've got a cold. And this is where I think the debate is going to go. And I was also interested in and quite encouraged actually that someone like Chris Hobson, Chief Executive of NHS Providers, who's always been banging the drum concerns about NHS being overwhelmed and protected it, even he admitted that actually many people arriving in hospital are arriving with other illnesses. And even he finally admitted, heaven knows why it's taken him so long, given how close he is to the system, he finally admitted that the statistics don't differentiate properly between those arriving with a bad case of COVID and those arriving for some other illness who happen to catch COVID in hospital. I can't understand why it's taken him so long, but I think this is really significant. And you've likewise got even a SAGE epidemiologist. I mean, this is significant. When a SAGE epidemiologist, Professor Peter Horby, he says that Omicron is milder and markedly less severe. So it seems to me that the tone of the debate is changing very rapidly. And it's significant that the US has reduced the isolation time from 10 days to 5 days. Now, we'd reduced it to 7 days. And in a sense, that's now where the debate is going. And whether it's NHS leaders, MPs, cabinet members, the pressure is going to be on how quickly can we reduce the isolation period from 7 days to 5 days, because now actually, not only in the NHS, but in other key public services, the big issue is it's more about the staff shortages from long periods of isolation, which in many cases are asymptomatic and therefore potentially unnecessary, relative to people who've actually got severe COVID. And I'm encouraged the way this debate is moving, and it won't be long, maybe it's starting now, when actually the debate's about when can asymptomatic people not have to isolate at all, but just to test daily. I mean, I don't know how long that debate may take, whether it's weeks, whether it's months, but that would be a really significant moment. And I must say, it is quite fun, quite interesting, seeing the pro-lockdown fanatics, how quickly they're going to cover their backside, how they're going to try and wriggle out of their previous positions. The likes of Nicola Sturgeon, the likes of Mark Drakeford, who've both essentially shut down Scotland and Wales over this period, the likes of Professor Neil Ferguson, I mean, why he's still involved, who, just to remind us all, he made the prediction that Omicron could lead to 5,000 deaths a day. Seriously? Let's hope that that was his last prediction. And let's hope, as a New Year present to us all, that he's fired, because he is simply not up to the job. And it's interesting, isn't it, seeing high-profile journalists, how they're starting to change their tone. The sort of the pro-fanatic, the pro-lockdown fanatic journalists, they're changing their tone. Of course, you know, not admitting they previously may have got it wrong. How the BBC is going to change. And then the Labour Party. I mean, let's just remember, just before Christmas, Wes Streeting was blaming the government for dither and delay. He was calling for immediate restrictions, for certainty. You know, I went back and checked. He was calling for more restrictions before Christmas. I suspect he may be getting many splinters sitting on the fence, trying to duck his previous doomsday predictions. I really do think that this is significant, it's encouraging, and we've all got to play a part in this debate as to what we should do in the new year, how quickly we can reduce that period of isolation. So give me your thoughts, your views. Do you think the worst is over? What would you like to see the isolation period reduced to? Do you think it's right at 7 days? Do you think we should follow the American example and reduce it to 5 days? How do you feel this is going to play out over the next 2 months? Bearing in mind, of course, a caveat to everything I've just said, we haven't yet had any real cold this winter. You know, it's incredibly mild, it's extraordinary. No doubt some people will say that's global warming, but it is very mild at the moment. If we have a really harsh cold snap in January or February, what implications that may have, or maybe that reactivates normal flu, which we expect at this time of the year. So give me a call, 0344 499 1000, and stay with us, because coming up, we've got the wonderful, the amazing Dominique Samuels to talk about this and to talk about other issues surrounding COVID, and also insulate Britain and the cost to all of us of their antics. Stay with us. You're listening to Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV weather.
This is your weather on Talk Radio TV. Warm and windy for the rest of the day. Earlier rain will clear, giving way to a dry afternoon with some sunny spells and staying nice and mild this evening. Now looking across the UK, it'll be dry for southern and central areas with some sunshine poking through, but further north, heavy rain will continue for parts of Scotland. Temperatures peaking at 14 degrees in London, but a strong breeze will leave areas feeling cool. Staying warm as we move into the evening with temperatures holding in the double digits. Some rain will set in and move northwards across England and Wales, but for the rest, a cloudy and windy night. Looking ahead at the 5-day forecast now, and cloudy in London, staying warm at 14 degrees for the next few days, but getting cooler as we move into next week. A similar outlook further south for Exeter. Tomorrow will be the warmest at 15 degrees. It'll be largely cloudy, but Sunday will see the onset of both sunshine and some showers. And more cloud ahead for Sheffield. Some sunny spells over the weekend, but these won't last long. And Monday will see colder temperatures peaking at just 9 degrees there. Further afield in America, evacuations are in order in Colorado as a wildfire burns very close to apartments southwest of Denver. Emergency vehicles are currently tending to the fire that covers nearly 150 acres. Stay with us for more weather updates here on Talk Radio TV.
Talk Radio.
Radio where you can let off some steam.
Reason re-engineered.
We think what you think.
Smart speaker, smart TV.
Deadly accurate debate.
Talk first, talk fast.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, and we're asking the key question. Do you think the worst is over yet? Do you think we're on the downslope permanently? Some great tweets coming in here. One which says, we are over the worst, but until the whole world and our own government realise this and lifts travel bans and vaccination status rules, we're all trapped in a parallel universe. I want to be optimistic. Whereas Mark, I'm not sure he's that optimistic. Mark says, I wouldn't call it on COVID just yet. Sir Alex Ferguson left Man United in 2013. We're on our 7th wave, i.e. manager, soon to be the 8th, and we're still in crisis. Well, I'm sorry about that, Mark. Kelt here, this is an interesting point. I was talking about what may happen in a cold spell in January and February. Kelt says a cold spell will keep everyone in their house, so there'll be less mixing, less spreading. That's a very interesting thought. Keep the thoughts coming in, the tweets, the calls 0344 499 1000. Now, we're going to be talking now to Dominique Samuels, Conservative commentator. Dominique, very good afternoon to you. And I hope you had a very good Christmas. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.
So we've got a number of things we want to discuss. Firstly, I've been asking the question about COVID. Are we over the worst? Fascinating how the tone of the experts and indeed some of the politicians seems to be shifting just in the last 24, 36 hours as the data emerges. Where are you on this? What's your sense as to the changing mood? Are you optimistic like me, or are you a bit more cautious?
I am optimistic, and people like me and obviously people like you, we have been on the losing side, really, if I'm being honest. Public opinion, largely, though there have been large swathes of the population that have been critical of restrictions and anti-lockdown and forced mandates and all of that. A lot of people have been effectively scared into submission, and people like me who are speaking out against vaccine passports were characterised as crazy, as dangerous. But now I think public mood is actually changing because the government has shown itself to have completely overreacted in terms of Omicron in particular. People are far more critical of the data that's being used now, with particular regards to how we're registering COVID hospitalisations, with a large number of those hospitalisations only being put down as COVID once a patient has actually been in hospital for other things. You've got people like Piers Morgan even sounding more critical. I've noticed Jeremy Vine has said things that are more critical of the COVID consensus. So overall, I am quite positive. I've always said I don't think this thing will ever end unless people start speaking out and taking a stand and saying, hey, wait a minute, government, we want to have control over our own lives. That consensus is moving in the other direction. So I do feel quite positive, actually.
I mean, I think it is interesting, the likes of, as you said, Piers Morgan, the likes of Jeremy Vine, in a sense, starting to ask questions almost of their own line of argument and perhaps moving to the middle, if not slightly towards us, about learning to live with it. But interestingly, of course, yes, Boris in respect of England, he made the call not to impose more restrictions over the Christmas period. He was criticised by that by many. But of course, it's far worse in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. Do you think there's a possibility, Dominic, that actually, bizarrely, Boris gets a sort of positive bounce in his own popularity, both perhaps from his own MPs and also from the public, because he did stand against some of the doomsters and the gloomsters in the media and amongst the experts?
Yeah, I have to agree, because I'm a bit cynical of people congratulating Boris as if he's done this amazing thing by announcing there aren't going to be any new restrictions before the new year. And I think this was a very calculated political decision. As you mentioned, he's not in a great place with his own MPs. So for him to look like, the more sane one in comparison to Wales and Scotland, yeah, that was a great move, but it also characterises him as someone who's only willing to put restrictions in place when absolutely necessary. And we're at a stage now where there shouldn't be any conversation whatsoever about restrictions. You've got MPs like Tobias Elwood basically threatening mandatory vaccination when he did an interview on Talk Radio recently. You've got other MPs spreading the 90% people in hospital are unvaccinated lie still. So you've still got some of his own MPs really pushing this fear agenda, I'm afraid. It's meant to make him look more reasonable and those in Scotland and Wales more unreasonable. But one thing I have noticed, even across the pond, Joe Biden actually said something that was really odd. He said that corona can't be solved on a federal level. It can only be solved on a state level. And that's what states like Florida have been saying from the very beginning. So I think in America and in England in particular, we are seeing a bit of a shift in terms of the approach towards COVID. And it seems that Wales, Scotland and other places in Europe, such as France, are going in the complete opposite direction. They're really turning into Australia.
Absolutely. And it'll be very interesting to see how quickly Wales and Scotland essentially row back on their very tight restrictions, because they could end up being actually very, very embarrassed. I want to move on just to the issue of Insulate Britain, Dominique, because reports emerging today that their demonstrations, when they broke the law, when they blocked roundabouts and when they blocked the motorways, that it cost around £4.3 million of our cash. It involved almost 7,000 officers. And with that sort of money, you could have insulated about 3,500 homes. You couldn't make this stuff up.
Exactly. It's just been ridiculous. And one of the main criticisms that I've seen is that the police really did nothing to stop the disruptive protests. I mean, when you actually look at the cause of Insulate Britain, it wants to insulate people's homes. Me personally, I don't think that is such a bad aim overall. However, it's the way they went about it, disrupting people's lives and putting the onus on the average everyday person. And that's why they've had such a negative backlash. I think the consensus now is that protests like that will not get you anywhere, because the public do not like being stopped from going about their day-to-day life, going to work and taking the kids to school.
Without question. I mean, it wouldn't have been that much money and involved so many officers, of course, if actually the police had acted promptly, robustly, and likewise the courts and the Crown Prosecution Service after the first or second episode. There was a massive flaw in the way that the government dealt with it. Would you agree with that?
Oh, of course, I would completely agree with that. And I think it's really reflective of sort of a selective approach when it comes to these sorts of protests. It seems that, protests that involve climate catastrophism, people like Insulate Britain, even Extinction Rebellion, they do get quite an easy ride when it comes to the police, despite them destroying public property and causing untold amounts of public damage that the taxpayer actually has to pay for. It is a problem and it needs sorting out.
Absolutely. No question at all. I think they really did rub people up the wrong way. And I think people were very, very angry with how they behaved, stopping people getting to appointments, getting to hospital, and being with their loved ones for doctor's appointments, that sort of thing. I think it was disastrous and did their cause huge harm. Finally, Dominique, I just want to talk about the Prime Minister, because obviously he was under a lot of pressure in the run-up to the recess just before Christmas. Mm-hmm. And where you think as they come back in the new year, do you think that people may have calmed down if the data is good on COVID, that people might be a little more forgiving and give him a bit longer? What's your sense of what this means for Boris into the new year?
Boris is in a very insecure position right now, and I think that's why he held off announcing more restrictions, despite the fact that he's got scientists and, you know, the political people on stage in his ear, the doom mongers, you know, calling for lockdowns, calling for the ruin of more and more people's lives. I do think overall he made the right call, but, you know, it's not just COVID. It's, you know, it's sleaze, it's scandals, it's his private life, it's, you know, scandals with regards to how he's paid for his wallpaper, it's, you know, deals that he's done with Tory donors that he can't really account for. There are loads of issues here that put Boris in a very precarious position. I don't know how long he's going to be able to hold on for, but I will say, I'm not going to lie, I don't even really think he likes being Prime Minister. I've seen someone, people have said this before, he looks absolutely miserable. So I think if he does go, I think he'll be very glad to, because I genuinely don't think he likes the job.
I mean, there's no question he's faced some huge challenges with COVID and with all the issues around that, and some massive big decisions. But so many of his problems actually are totally self-inflicted by his own personal judgments, whether it was on trying to save Owen Paterson's skin, trying to pay for some expensive wallpaper, and so on. And in a sense, it's probably that if he goes, he'll be completely self-inflicted, the architect of his own downfall. But do you think that his MPs will give him beyond the local council elections in May?
I think so, because I think the country's in a position where I don't think it could handle getting rid of another Conservative Party leader. I think that would be completely the wrong move. With the North Shropshire by-election and how bad that was for the Conservatives, though, that is an indication that maybe Boris's time is running out, because everyone knows with the Tories, once you stop winning those elections, you're out.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? You know, they all want to be re-elected. They don't want to lose their jobs. And if they sense that he's not going to get them re-elected, that's when they'll move on him.
Exactly. And also, in the context of COVID in particular as well, they probably will start looking at other leaders, such as Liz Truss, for example. She's been touted continuously throughout the past few weeks as a potential leader. They probably want someone fresh that isn't marred by the pandemic and all of the issues that have come around that, to sort of present someone new to the electorate, that, you know, a new face. I'm a bit sceptical of that personally. I think you probably know this, but I think we need complete change. I don't think we need another face within the Conservative Party to sell to individuals. I think we need actual policy change, but there you go.
Exactly. And the big issues that actually face the country and the government in the coming months is the huge potential, the tax rises that have been announced by the government, the huge costs coming down the pipe from gas price increases, the green agenda, and also the potential rises in council tax, which could be as high as 6%. These are massive, massive issues for the government.
Yeah, these are things that the government is going to have to deal with. And for me, it's the big thing is transparency, being honest with people about what is to come, instead of sort of distracting the public with COVID hysteria, because really we're out of the woods at the moment. We need to start thinking about how we're going to pay back all the money we've spent over the past 2 years. And the truth is, individuals are going to have to pay. He's going to have to look at the green agenda and whether or not that is going to be received very well. But it seems the government is doing completely the opposite of everything it pledged to do upon being elected.
It certainly is. It's going in completely the wrong direction. It's boxed itself in a corner. Dominic, thank you so much for your thoughts. Have a very happy new year, and we will see you in 2022. That was Dominic Samuels with her thoughts on the government, on the Prime Minister, on the state of COVID, and Insulate Britain. Coming up after the break, we're going to be going all the way to South Africa and speaking to Dr. Michelle Groom about what's going on in South Africa with Omicron and her thoughts about how we reacted to it here in the UK. This is Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Reason re-engineered. Richard Tice on Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
On your smart TV.
From global current affairs to the issues that hit closer to home.
Richard Tice. Fighting your corner on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk on Talk Radio. And we're asking this big question. Do you think we're over the worst of it? Are we on the downslope? Should we be easing the isolation time from 7 days to 5 days, or indeed shorter? Interesting just listening to the news there, how footballers caught COVID for the second time. Again, I think that's part of actually learning to live with it. I know a number of people, even who've had the booster jab, who've caught it for the second time in a milder form. And I just think that's the way this is going to go forwards. Keep the tweets coming in as well, or the calls 0344 499 1000. A tweet here. Hi Richard, please tell Mr. Drakeford the news about the data and the tone of people's conversation, and thank Jamie Jenkins, who's read the data and called out people who should know better. I really do think it's going to be very interesting how some of the experts explain themselves over the coming week. Well, I'm delighted now that we are going to be joined shortly, just sorting out the Zoom, by Dr. Michelle Groom in South Africa, because let's just remember, of course, Omicron came from South Africa and they did a brilliant job highlighting it very quickly as a potential variant of concern, telling the world about it, but also saying what they were seeing was that it was actually milder and that they weren't that concerned about it. And in a sense, the world reacted in a really what looks like an extreme way, a significant, arguably overreaction. Here in the UK, we immediately put South Africa on the red list, put some other countries on the red list, clamped down on travel. And it was amazing, actually. South Africa then said, hang on, what are you doing? Why are you reacting so badly? When actually all the early signs are that it's milder, it's less of a concern. And it was extraordinary how the response was so extreme. It was almost as though some of the pro-lockdown experts, they'd been waiting for this variant, any variant of concern that they could essentially jump on and argue that we had to take the most extreme restrictions, whether it was the SAGE experts, whether it was people from the Labour Party. And just fascinating how actually we should have listened to the experts in South Africa as to their view that it was milder. I think we're still waiting. We're still waiting for Michelle, having a few hiccups. We're going to go to a call instead. Peter in Sussex. Good afternoon. How are you doing?
Hello. Well, good afternoon, Richard. All I want to do is say that last year, last year, I went to Spain, right, and then that was in October, and then we were supposed to come back in November, but we couldn't get back because, December, we couldn't get back. It's because the transport minister. One minute he said something at one thing, and then there was another thing. So we ended up coming back this year in May because we had so many vouchers.
You were away for about 6 months, were you, Peter?
6 months, and it wasn't our fault. Every time we went for a flight, it got cancelled.
You might have been in the best place. It was a pretty challenging lockdown here. So what's your view, just before we go to Michelle Grimm, what's your view? Do you think we're over the worst? Are you optimistic?
Yeah, we're over the worst, and the Conservative government, they've got to stop flip-flopping around and just, and as they say, and they should let us all go on holiday.
We've got to get on with our lives. Absolutely, Peter. Thank you for that call. We're going to go down to South Africa now, where we've got Dr. Michelle Groom, who is the head of the Division of Public Health Surveillance and Response. Michelle, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us. So we're just obviously Omicron was first found in South Africa, and you did a brilliant job of highlighting to the world that it was a potential variant of concern. Just interested, what's the latest news in South Africa? You're obviously a few weeks ahead, for example, of the UK. What's the news in terms of hospitalisations, intensive care bed occupancy, and the death rate relative to where it was pre-Omicron?
Yeah, so I think we've definitely still, we saw this very rapid rise in the number of cases in the last 4 weeks, and that seems to have kind of stabilized. We have actually seen decreases in the last week. I think some of that may be accounted for a little bit for the Christmas period, but definitely in the Gauteng province, which was the first province to see this, we've definitely reached the peak. And in terms of cases, this was a similar peak in terms of case numbers to our Delta wave. But we saw that deaths were only at around, were much lower. Hospitalizations at around 50% of what we'd seen in Delta. Now with Omicron, and deaths just over 10% of what we'd actually seen for our Delta wave. So definitely in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, we've seen this disconnect with the number of cases, that we've seen compared to number of hospitalizations and deaths. And definitely seems as well to be amongst those that are hospitalized, there's, less severe disease, where amongst the hospitalizations with Delta, I think there was around 65% of them were kind of severe, so needing ventilation, yes, supplemental oxygen. And with Omicron, that's just under 30%.
And are you
definitely seeming very positive.
That sounds very encouraging, and in a sense reinforces everything that I think you were saying originally. Yeah. And are you seeing shorter hospital stays?
Yes, so we actually are seeing shorter hospital stays, which I think also just bodes well in terms of opening up beds. So for those that are hospitalized, they're not having these long stays. So definitely in terms of all our severity indicators, I think the initial trends are definitely persisting. And I think what we were seeing for, the district that first started has really been seen in the Gauteng province and now being seen across the country, although some of our provinces are still seeing high case numbers.
Sure. And what impact has the arrival of Omicron had on your vaccination rate? Have you seen many more people go for vaccination or not?
Yeah, so I think it has increased slightly. I think, we had kind of reached a bit of a plateau in terms of our vaccination rates. So we did see, towards the beginning of Omicron, a slight increase again in those accessing vaccination. But once again, now it's the holiday period. And so overall, our rates are slightly low again. But I think it was definitely incentive for many to vaccinate that had not yet been vaccinated.
And I'm interested, which vaccines are you mainly using in South Africa, or are you using the whole range?
Yeah, so we've got two. So we're using the Pfizer vaccine, which is the one that's mostly been used in our older population. So 2 doses of Pfizer, and then we're also using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So that was initially given to our healthcare workers as well as select groups, kind of teachers, and was available to the rest of the population. But most has been Pfizer, and we're about to start our booster program in the new year in terms of those that. So we were quite late in starting our vaccination program in May of this year, and so I think those that are now eligible for their booster will start from January.
Out of interest, because our booster program has been hugely accelerated, who are you offering the booster to? Is it just the sort of the vulnerable groups, or a broader age range?
Yeah, so eventually we will make it available to all, but we started our primary vaccination series with the older age groups, which was our over 60s, and so those would be the ones that were eligible. So definitely for Pfizer, we've said they'd only be eligible for booster 6 months after their second dose. So those ones that got Pfizer would only be eligible now. Though for the Johnson & Johnson, our regulator has approved use after 2 months. So definitely those with J&J would be able to get a booster sooner than the Pfizers.
And what's the isolation period required for positive cases in South Africa? Because there's quite an emerging debate, both in the US and starting here in Britain, and I suspect obviously around the world, about reducing the isolation period.
Yeah, so our Ministerial Advisory Committee had put forward some, I think, rather kind of drastic recommendations, which I think the Department of Health is still considering. I think they had issued something last week, but are now just revising in terms of providing clarity on some of those. So I think definitely for South Africa, interventions like contact tracing have been very difficult. And so, we really would look towards, revising the need for contact tracing and quarantine, and definitely, the Ministerial Advisory Committee's recommendation was definitely to decrease, the isolation period.
And what is it currently?
To 8 days.
To 8 days.
Well, currently it's 10 days.
Right.
And so I think we'd already, in one of the previous waves, decreased from 14 to 10. So it would be decreasing to 8.
Right. Okay. So from 10 to 8, we've just gone down to 7. America's just gone down to 5. And
to 5 years or so.
So there's obviously, this is going to be a key part of the debate over the coming weeks. And I guess South Africa will also be very keen that we reopen essentially travel for tourism and things in the new year, because that's obviously had a huge impact. Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess, we've managed to get through this wave thus far without having to increase our level of restrictions, I think, which has been really positive. And I think, we'd really look towards trying to move towards, living with COVID rather than, having all these, restrictions and added, rather resource-intensive guidelines and policies in place. But we would definitely welcome the tourism and the opening of those. Thank you so much, Michelle, for those thoughts. Absolutely fascinating. That was Dr. Michelle Groom, the head of the Division of Public Health Surveillance in South Africa, with her thoughts. Fascinating because, of course, Omicron started there. And this debate about the isolation period going on all over the world. Coming up, stay with us. We'll be taking your calls, your tweets, your messages. Don't hold back. Give me your view. 0344 499 1000. Do you believe that the COVID crisis is well over the worst? We're on the downslope. What do you think the isolation period should it stay at 7 days? Should we reduce it? Keep those calls coming in. And then we're going to be talking at the top of the hour to Sophie Corcoran about a variety of issues. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV weather.
This is your weather on Talk Radio TV. Warm and windy for the rest of the day. Earlier rain will clear, giving way to a dry afternoon with some sunny spells and staying nice and mild this evening. Now, looking across the UK, it'll be dry for southern and central areas with some sunshine poking through, but further north, heavy rain will continue for parts of Scotland. Staying warm as we move into the evening, and some rain will set in and move northwards across England and Wales. Stay with us for more weather updates here on Talk Radio TV.
It's not all bad news.
Beware of sharp comments.
I listen to Talk Radio.
A national treasure.
Plain talking radio.
23 and a half hours a day.
Talk Radio.
The home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here at Talk Radio, and we've been talking then to Michelle Groom down in South Africa about what's going on with Omicron down there. Interesting tweets coming in. One here from Dave who said, "Nothing's changing. New digital laws for work and renting property don't be taken in," Dave says, "by Boris being reluctant to shut down door-to-door jabs now. I may actually be hunted to my house." Clearly Dave is very concerned. Paul here, this would be over if it wasn't for the idiot governments in all parts of the UK. The milder variant is part of the situation becoming normalised, but the governments have become too used to power. I think that is a strong sense of concern about governments and politicians becoming used to power. Let's go to our calls. We're going to go to Susan, who's in Exeter. Good afternoon, Susan. What are your thoughts?
Oh, good afternoon, Richard. Thank you very much for taking my call. As a person myself of average intelligence, there's a question that keeps burning through my mind all the time, and it won't go away, regarding the COVID vaccines. And I don't know if anybody else has sort of got this problem, but the question is, how effective is this vaccine if we have to have boosters we have to have two initially within 3 months apart of each other, and then we have to have boosters. If you have a regular booster vaccination against things like diphtheria, polio, tetanus, you're done. You don't have to bother for many years after that.
Well, in a sense, that's the big question: is the duration of the vaccines, and in a sense, one slightly got to learn just through experience. There was obviously the theory of them, but in reality, sometimes things change, particularly, of course, when you get variants. A bit like with flu, there's an annual flu vaccine, and they try and judge how flu's varying, and there are concerns that the booster may only, the efficacy starts to wane after about 10 weeks, I think was what I recently saw. And so this is definitely one of the big debates going forwards for people who are vulnerable, for people who want the booster, how long it's going to last. Can they make it will they be able to make it something that lasts as long as a year, or are most people going to end up feeling that actually they've had it once or twice? We may get to a situation, Susan, and I was just thinking about this over Christmas, where in a sense you sort of expect to get a mild version of whether it's flu or COVID. You may barely know the difference once a year, in the same way that we used to get a cold or flu once a year.
Yeah. Well, I actually think I had the virus when it initially came about. And I was laid up in bed like many, many other people. And I let my immunity get on with it. We didn't have a vaccine at that point, or we didn't have an antibody. We didn't have any way of testing to see whether you'd had it or not.
Indeed.
And I know a lot of people, like myself, Richard, thousands of us, we did the same. I think, we should allow our immunity to do a certain amount here. But obviously, if you're poorly and you've got medical conditions in the first place, you can't allow, you're not in a position to do that.
Exactly. Well, at the end of the day, we have now to learn to live with this, Susan, and we have to essentially see what variants come down the pipe after Omicron. What we do know is that something will come. I'm sure of that. Maybe once a year, who knows? We'll just have to keep a close eye on it. Thanks for that very much, Susan. Meanwhile, on the tweets, Dan, he tweeted, "It's time to trust the vaccine and stop asking well people to isolate. If you can catch COVID more than once, we'll be in and out of isolation forever. It's time to move on. Otherwise, it won't be over if we keep isolating. That's from Dan. Let's go from Exeter way up to Thirsk, where Kevin has got some thoughts. Hi there, Kevin.
Hello there. Yeah, I was just thinking about when we were discussing the reform of the House of Lords, about it not being particularly representative of the people, and maybe reforming it to become more representative of the people rather than peerages and the such.
How would you like to reform it then, Kevin?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about along the lines of, it is my understanding that when bills are being put forward, that they are actually overseen, or the bodies developing them do ask for representatives of industry and such like to look at them. Why not make that more official? Why not have a tenure for the House of Lords, so that representative people are brought in from the community, from industry, from all the aspects of society.
So so Kevin, would you not have any elected second chamber? You'd just have, in a sense, wise experts on a rotating basis?
On a rotational basis, so that they're in for a tenure, and then people look at what would be representative across the government, would look at what's representative across the country, and ask the body to come in. And they can review.
And what tenure would you put on it, Kevin? How long? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
I think 3-4 year life of a government.
Okay, which of course is that well, it's 5 years, so you're talking about a 4 to 5 year period, which is arguably relatively short. And would you bring in some regional element to it, so that you've got representation from where you are in Yorkshire, from down in the southwest?
It would be representative across the country, so that you would draw people in from all aspects of society from across the country as a body to review bills and laws as they're being brought in for that period of tenure, and then it changes.
And here comes the crunch question then, Kevin. Who's going to appoint these experts? How are they going to be chosen?
That could be the number bit. I mean, at the end of the day, what you might do is, like to do with your police and crime commissions, is the local community select them.
Ah, there you are. That's a very interesting idea. So you have sort of regional elections for some local people, regional experts. That's a fascinating thought there, Kevin. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah, and so it truly becomes representative of the people, by the people, for the people.
Fantastic. I definitely want to see massive reform of the House of Lords. It's absurdly large. I'd bring it down to 100, maybe 150. Some fascinating thoughts there. Thank you for that, Kevin, about different ways to reform the House of Lords. Kevin's preference is to bring in some regional experts for the range of subject matters that we need. Coming up after the news, we're going to be speaking to Sophie Corcoran about matters politics, about Boris. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online, and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 2, I'm Anila Dami. Lateral flows and PCRs are unavailable in England as pharmacies blame the inconsistent supply chain. Warnings from the Prime Minister that up to 90% of COVID patients in intensive care have not been boosted. And the tennis world number one, Novak Djokovic pulls out of the Australian Open. Pharmacists are calling for urgent action to improve the supply of COVID tests as lateral flow home deliveries and PCR appointments become unavailable across the whole of England. Chemists are also having to turn people away empty-handed due to what they're calling low and inconsistent supplies. Yesterday, a record 117,000 cases were recorded in England. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says up to 90% of people who are in intensive care with COVID are not boosted. Boris Johnson said there are 2.4 million eligible double-jabbed people yet to take up the offer of a third dose and praised those who have had their third jab.
We've done about 32.5, maybe more, million booster jabs now. And that is allowing us to go ahead with New Year in the cautious way that we are.
A pro-democracy news website in Hong Kong has announced it's shutting down after senior staff were arrested. 7 journalists from the independent website Stand News are being accused of publishing articles inciting hate against the authorities. And world tennis number one Novak Djokovic has pulled out of the Australian Open, according to reports. It comes as all players competing are required either to be vaccinated or provide proof of medical exemption, but the information will not be made public. He's previously expressed that freedom of choice is essential when it comes to vaccinations, but has made no further comment. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Standing up, speaking out. Richard Tice. Powered by debate.
Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Richard Tice. A man of impeccable pedigree. Richard Tice. Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're well into the second hour and we've been talking about Boris Johnson. We've been talking about whether we're over the worst of COVID. We're on the downslope, reducing the isolation period, and some great stuff we had from South Africa from Michelle Groom. But now we want to look forward. We're still going to keep talking throughout the whole show about House of Lords. Keep the calls coming in 0344 499 1000 on how you would reform the House of Lords, or would you leave it as it is? Maybe you want to get promoted into it. We're going to now be joined by Sophie Corcoran, a political commentator and from Durham University, with her thoughts on the latest for the Prime Minister, because interestingly, the Conservative Home website, they do a regular survey of their readers' views, Conservative members' views about who they rate, who's doing well, who's doing badly, who should be the next Prime Minister or the next leader of the Tory party. And Boris's poll ratings on Conservative Home have plummeted, I think, to the lowest that he's ever received since becoming leader over 2 years ago. Sophie, a very good afternoon to you. I hope you've had a fine Christmas and New Year. Sorry, not New Year, we haven't quite got there yet. Hope you had a good Christmas. So what are your thoughts on the changing mood for the Prime Minister in the party, these poll ratings from Conservative Home? Do you think he's, with potentially his right call about not introducing more restrictions, is that going to help him in the new year?
Yes, I believe it will help him, but I do not believe he has really got a lot that he can do anymore. I think this mood has been reflected in my own political journey. Obviously, I left the Conservative Party earlier this year. I was a very big Boris supporter when I first joined the party. and throughout his early stages of his leadership, I would have voted him if I did at the time for my leadership candidate. I also probably would have voted him in the 2019 general election should I have been able to vote. Obviously, I wasn't old enough, so I couldn't. I also ran for the Conservative Party back in 2020. And to do that, you have to be somebody who is not just a supporter of the party and not just somebody who would vote for the Conservative Party, but somebody who is really loyal to that party and who would happily put that name,
exactly,
that badge over your own name. But unfortunately,
so you don't think that he over the next few months can get it back? You think he's gone too far?
Yes, I think we have seen what's come out, the last month or so, obviously scandal after scandal with the Christmas party thing. He's lost a lot of support from backbenchers over, I think it was 101 backbenchers that rebelled, if I remember.
That's right.
And a lot of people are attesting this blockading and not having the restrictions being reintroduced to Boris himself. I have two things to say about that. Personally, I'm not going to thank Boris for giving me my freedom back because my freedoms are a right, not a privilege. Therefore, I'm not going to thank him for giving me them back. He is not doing me a favour. He's doing what he's supposed to do.
100% agreed. But in a sense, maybe it was the 101 Tory MPs that gave him a back then.
I don't think it was his doing. I think it was the fact that those MPs have rebelled. So he has... he's got to wake up. Otherwise, those MPs that are rebelled, their letters are going into 1922 and he's in trouble. And I think he's realised that he's in trouble because we saw the massive loss, obviously, in North Shropshire. Didn't perform as well as they would have liked in the other by-election that they did. They're just not. They lost a massive majority there as well. So...
Yes, that was down in Bexley where their majority reduced from about 18,000 down to about just over 4,000. And I guess the question is, what do you think they'll give him until the May elections to work it out as to whether or not he can win a future general election for them?
I think they will give him time, but I think if he doesn't perform as well as he can in May, then his time is up because the only thing he's good at is winning elections, and if he can't do that, he's got nothing. So
absolutely. And then if we can just sort of move on to, I mean, what's the mood amongst yourself, but also your friends, people you speak to, interact with, in terms of COVID itself? Do you feel people sense that it's very much over, that we've got to get on with it, or is there still a level of anxiety and fear, and how that may play out in universities as well?
There is a lot of fear about how it's going to play out in universities because a lot of the time the universities don't really follow the science or the guidance. They tend to sort of make their own minds up on what benefits their bank accounts the best. So I think there is a lot of fear that we are going to face further restrictions. Durham have actually held off for quite a while. They've said that they're not going to bring any in and make sure that their measures are proportionate and they come in sort of gradually. However, some universities have already decided that they are going online. So there is a lot of anxiousness whether we are actually going to again face another year of online learning. But I think we're all just fed up of COVID. Amongst us, the only thing that we're scared of is restrictions. None of us are scared of COVID.
So in terms of Durham, you're saying that you'll still have face-to-face lectures next term, is it? But in other universities, that's obviously changed. And how quickly do you think, if universities have gone to online lectures, which clearly can't be as good as face-to-face, how quickly are they likely to go back to face-to-face, or is it actually rather convenient for the lecturers?
Oh, it's rather convenient for not just the lecturers, but the actual university and the business model as a whole. A lot of them are really oversubscribed. So Durham actually do some lectures online now still, purely because they took so many students on that they can't fit them all in the lecture hall.
Wow. So essentially they've allowed money to talk, and they've just sold as many places as they can, even though they haven't actually got the places physically in the university. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. So it got to a point at the beginning of last year for Durham that also because of the way universities work, they tend to give out offers because they know for a fact that the exams are going to knock a lot of people out, especially the top universities like Durham. Whereas unfortunately we had obviously the teacher assessed grades, the grade inflation was unprecedented. So everybody got into university and now they're completely oversubscribed. They had to move people into like private halls because they just didn't have space for us.
So it sounds a bit like the Ryanair model of overselling airline tickets on planes. They expected people to fall away and they didn't.
Yeah, so that's what they've done. So unfortunately now, obviously, the online learning is beneficial for them. So that's why a lot of us aren't comfortable that they're not going to just fit and sit and do what the government tell them, because this is actually quite beneficial for universities. Not necessarily for lecturers, because a lot of lecturers are completely sick and tired of doing it from home, because their whole job is to get up in front of people and speak. That's what they're there for. And when they're doing it on Zoom, it's not quite... It's like us speaking to an empty audience as well.
But it sounds as though that could be very tempting for universities going forwards, for the likes of Durham on the Russell Group, to continue essentially to oversell on the basis that actually that's a lot more money and they've worked out a way of doing it. And so that may be advantageous for them in the sort of the Premier League of universities, but that could be much more challenging for some of the other universities.
Yeah, I agree. I think... I know before the break, Imperial went online already, and there's been a few people on my Snapchat, I don't know what uni they go to, that have said that their university has already gone back online.
But of course, no discount offered, even though there's an online offer only.
Of course, you're paying $9,000 for what I call a glorified YouTube video.
Shocking, absolutely shocking. And we've been having a debate on the show today, Sophie, about the House of Lords, whether it should be abolished, reformed, and really interested in your views, and you're obviously politically very engaged with folk at Durham. What's the mood amongst sort of undergraduates in terms of the House of Lords? Would people like to see it abolished, reformed, or left as is?
A lot of those who are on the left, which is, well, most of them, obviously want to see it abolished completely because they're unelected. And this idea of the Houses of Lords being an elitist institution, obviously we have those who have hereditary peers who have inherited their titles. They obviously do not like that at all. I think that we should keep it. It's tradition. It's part of our political nature. I believe that we should keep the House of Lords. I like it being there. I like the fact that we have really experienced individuals in the other chamber scrutinising things from their area of expertise. And I do kind of like the hereditary peers. We've cut it down, of course.
But but there's over 800 of them, and some of them, frankly, like Boris's brother. I'm not sure what he's an expert on. So would you reform it, or would you just essentially just accept the cost of it? Which I think there was a report today showing that the cost of the daily allowances and expenses was some 15 million.
Well, I would get rid of the bishops from the House of Lords.
Well, they're an expert in religion.
I don't think that we should be governing based on religion anymore, to be honest, Richard. I don't think they have a place in the House of Lords anymore. But I do believe that we have some really, really experienced people in there, quality people in there. I do think that sometimes we're giving out peerages like candy. I think we need to stop doing that.
And what size would you reform it to? I mean, it's the second largest legislative chamber in the world after the Chinese National Congress.
Oh God, I think it should mirror the Commons.
Okay, so
and I think you should only accept a peerage when somebody in the House of Lords dies.
So I think it steps away. So the Commons is 650. So you'd only reduce it by give or take 150 to 200. You're not as radical as me wanting to bring it down to about 100 to 150.
No, well, at least you still want to keep it. Some people want to get rid of it altogether, but I feel like we have unexperienced politicians in the other chamber.
I think it's good to have a revising chamber. I think it's good to have more regional representation. I like the expertise, and I think it's really good to have more debate and discussion about it, because at the moment I think we've got essentially the worst of all worlds, where it's basically a house of patronage, of favours. And many of the people who go in there, actually, who have got real expertise, they never bother to turn up. They just enjoy the title and the name.
Yeah, I think we need to have more of a nuanced conversation about this. A lot of the times it stems between abolish or keep. And I think somewhere in the middle comes reform.
Correct.
And I think we need to have a conversation of how we reform the House of Lords, not necessarily do we keep it or not.
So essentially, you're for reforming it, but somewhat more marginally than I think probably I am.
Yeah, because I'm naturally would be a conservative, so I like to keep my traditions intact.
Fantastic. Sophie, thank you so much for those thoughts on Boris's prospects of retaining his position despite his low poll ratings, and on the House of Lords and universities. Thank you for that, Sophie. Keep the calls coming in, 0344 499 1000. What you think about where we're going with COVID, what you think about House of Lords, keep, abolish, reform, change, whatever. Don't go away. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk.
Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV weather.
This is your weather on Talk Radio TV. Warm and windy for the rest of the day. Earlier rain will clear, giving way to a dry afternoon with some sunny spells and staying nice and mild this evening. Now, looking across the UK, it'll be dry for southern and central areas with some sunshine poking through, but further north, heavy rain will continue for parts of Scotland. Staying warm as we move into the evening, and some rain will set in and move northwards across England and Wales. Stay with us for more weather updates here on Talk Radio TV.
Re-engineered. Richard Tice on Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
On your smart TV.
From global current affairs to the issues that hit closer to home.
Richard Tice. Fighting your corner on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. So we've been talking about whether or not we've seen the worst of COVID. Let's all hope so. and essentially how quickly, for example, Wales and Scotland might ease the restrictions. But I really want now to focus on what I think will be much bigger challenges for 2022, and that's the cost of living crisis. And it's all over the papers today, the year of the squeeze, and I suspect it's the wrong sort of squeeze because people, frankly, are going to face some huge increases in their bills. And what really winds me up about this is that so much of this is totally self-inflicted, these cost increases, by this government, in many cases that I just don't think understands. And the three key elements are essentially the huge increase in energy prices, which is a direct result of their energy policies over the last decade, as well as their energy policies, their what I call their net stupid energy policies, which are going to impact on all of us over the next 5 to 10 years. The second thing, of course, is the tax increases, which hit us all hard in April. And then the third thing, which is not really being talked about, is the increase in council taxes, which is going to come in April as well. I'm delighted we're joined now by Danielle Boxall from the Taxpayers Alliance, who always have a very keen eye on government spending and in particular waste. Danielle, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us in this festive season. So you folk at the Taxpayers Alliance, you're closer to this than anybody. Do you think the average figure that's being reported of about £1,200, do you think that's about right, or do you think it could indeed be even more?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Richard, and happy Christmas to you too. I think the Resolution Foundation's figures are a bit of a minimum, really. That's that's sort of the bar. Real figures that we will see next year are only going to be higher. I mean, there were talks this year that prices of food are going up. Prices of petrol is going up. Have been driving. We're just
struggling with the signal, Danielle. I think what we might try and do is just reconnect on that. Whilst we're doing that, the other key thing, of course, to remember, whatever figures we hear, whether it's £1,000, £1,200, or £1,500, of course, in order to afford that, actually, that's the net figure, the cost to us as an individual, all of us. But the truth is, you've got to earn another 20 or 30% in terms of gross before tax in order to be able to afford that. And I think this is one of the really big things about this that people are not yet really appreciating. I talked yesterday about just the cost of energy being increasing in the next few months by £700. That's £1,000 before tax. Well, then you add on these council tax things. I think we've got Danielle back. I was just saying, Danielle, these increases, of course, essentially, you've actually got to add on the tax in order for someone to work out what they need to earn to be able to afford it.
Well, exactly. And, we're seeing a triple whammy, really, of tax increases this year. We've got the national insurance hike, which we all know about, council tax increases, which we've just heard this morning, that could be as high as 6% in certain councils, because according to the small print, apparently if a council didn't rise their taxes in the previous year, so in 2021, next year in 2022, they could increase it by double. So they could increase it by 6% instead of the 3%, which is the limit that most councils can increase their council tax by. So we're going to see lots of council tax bills, hitting over £2,000. Last year, we saw over 100 council tax bills go over that mark. So there's going to be a lot more to come in the next year. And then we're also seeing an income tax freeze. And this is really important because it effectively works as a self-tax. And it drags people into paying higher brackets of tax than they would necessarily have been, especially when we're seeing, things becoming more expensive, food prices going up, household bills are soaring, as you mentioned. People are going to feel like they've got a lot less in their back pockets than they did before.
And you're so right, because that income tax threshold freeze, which is a sort of stealth tax because you don't see it, explicitly in your pay packet. But in reality, and I remember looking at this, actually what the Chancellor is doing is bringing an additional million of the lowest paid, the least well off in society, in communities, bringing them into paying income tax at that lower threshold, which I just think it's morally unforgivable.
Yeah, and that's not forgetting that the national insurance increase that's coming in is going to impact people on even lower incomes than that. So I think the income tax lowest band is about £12,500, but the lowest band for national insurance is about £9,000. So we're going to see a lot more people paying extra on national insurance. And that's not taking into account the fact that national insurance is also a tax on employers. So there's going to be businesses seeing the cost of hiring getting more expensive, meaning that they're not going to be likely to hire more people. So it's going to slow down an economy that has only really just sort of started to get back to normal after a year and a half, almost 2 years of restrictions. So it's sort of a grim picture for the year ahead about how our economy is going to grow.
It is a really challenging picture, and I think the economic forecasts, I think in the Chancellor's numbers in his budget, he was talking about 6% growth. That seems to be being revised down by many economists, and the city forecast is down to somewhere in the 4 to 4.5%. Have you at the Taxpayers Alliance got a specific sort of growth forecast you think is going to happen next year, or are you taking a consensus view from others?
Yeah, we tend to take our sort of growth figures from elsewhere, but things we do look at are things like, how it's going to impact the poorest incomes. So people on the 10% lowest incomes already pay. They already take basically 50% of their income after tax. So they already lose about half of their income in tax. And this is before the national insurance increases going in. This is before the income tax threshold really takes hold. And this is before council taxes really rise in the next couple of months. So, what we're going to see here is the poorest households that are facing huge energy bills, by the way, as well, really being squeezed for the sort of last remaining money that they have.
And that's what really concerns me as well, is the rise in energy costs, essentially, which is completely out of the government's hands because of the way they've outsourced energy to other countries. They've exposed us strategically to the whims of Putin and the whims of Macron. And, that means that energy prices, they could do anything. And if it's really cold over January and February, then the prices we've just seen in recent weeks, the growth in prices, could continue upwards.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the effect of the energy price cap has actually had the opposite of what it was intended for. It was supposed to keep prices down for struggling households, but in fact, it actually means that there's less competition because, as we've seen, there's various companies failing to sort of deal with these sort of price caps. So that means that there's less competition in the markets, which means there's less incentive for companies to keep their prices down so that they can, beat the other companies to get the most customers. But it's not just that; it's also the cost of the green subsidies that are also put on energy bills, which at the end of the day they end up being paid for by the consumer.
Completely. And so there was a meeting earlier this week between the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng and various of the heads of various energy firms. And one of the things they talked about, I'd be interested in your view on this, was a huge fund, in a sense. It sort of feels like a loan from the government to the energy companies so that they could smooth out the increase in these bills. But of course, the flaw in that whole idea is they seem to think that these price increases, are a one-off and they'll fall back to previous levels. But if actually they're not a one-off, if they stay at these upper levels, that doesn't work at all.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, unfortunately, we don't really have any sort of domestic supply, so we're still reliant on the sort of global energy prices, and that means that the prices are very high at the moment. And if they do stay high, we haven't really got, because of the energy price cap, we haven't got the storage facilities to make it cheaper in the short term so that we can figure out what we're going to do next. And it seems like it's all sort of short-term thinking with no sort of long-term strategy about how this is going to play out in the future.
And do you at the Taxpayers Alliance, do you look closely at these huge subsidies that are paid essentially by us, the consumers, to the owners of the renewable energy businesses, whether it's the solar farms, whether it's the huge wind turbines, all of which, of course, are owned by very often overseas private equity group, private investors, or sovereign wealth funds, and essentially it's us that's picking up the tab.
Yeah, exactly. And, perhaps, 10 years ago when renewable energy was just sort of coming out, you could have made the argument that, you needed to help this sort of fledgling industry. But, it's no longer a backroom startup. It's fully fledged now, and it's something that consumers are looking for. It's not something that is sort of, a bit sort of something that people wouldn't necessarily turn to. People are becoming more environmentally conscious, and they're looking for these kind of things. So there is a sort of consumer demand out there. So I don't think it needs to be propped up by the government or indeed the consumer.
But of course, it is still extremely expensive. The cost, the guarantees for these wind farms, the guaranteed price they require is still much higher than the normal market price. And my concern is that essentially we're guaranteeing large private equity style financial returns when actually pension funds would be looking for a much lower return.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it just seems like the government sort of, looking to sort of go on with this sort of net zero agenda without really thinking about the real cost that it's going to have on the taxpayer.
Which we know is huge. I understand that it's almost £200 per year per household currently, and that cost is only going up. Have you got any forecasts, your own forecasts or own thoughts?
No, we don't have any forecasts on the sort of cost of net zero. I mean, we asked the Chancellor at the Conservative Party conference what he thinks the cost of net zero is going to be, and he had no idea. He said he doesn't know how much it's going to cost, and it's not something that they're really planning for, which was a bit concerning for us. So, this is something that's the government's main agenda, and it's where they're spending most of their money, and they don't really know or have any idea about how much it's going to cost.
Pretty extraordinary, Danielle, that the government doesn't seem to have done any cost-benefit analysis of the implications for the country and for all of us as individuals, as families, of their net zero energy policies. They don't know whether it's 1 trillion, 2 trillion or 5 trillion, frankly.
Yeah, of course. And there are ways that they can sort of move towards that would perhaps be beneficial for families. For example, encouraging people to get A-star rated fridge freezers, for example, would be great for reducing households' energy bills because they'll be more efficient. But they don't really seem to have any sort of drive to do the sort of simple steps. They just want to go to the big things like funding massive renewable energy sectors rather than getting households, bills under control. It
sound bites. It appeases the eco lobby, but I don't think it's in the best interests of families up and down the country. Danielle, thank you so much for your thoughts there on the year of the squeeze, the cost of living crisis that faces us in 2022. Give us a call with your thoughts, whether it's on the House of Lords reform, COVID, or indeed 2022, this cost of living crisis. 0344 499 1000. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
New. Best recipe ever. Talk Radio.
Captivating, campaigning, controversial. Powered by common sense.
May cause mild irritation.
The word on the street.
Standing up for the little guy.
Rewire your thinking.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. We're coming up to the end of the second hour. We're going to be taking some calls in a second. But just a tweet come in from David about COVID. In his opinion, this saga has been an assault on the public to achieve two things, power and money. Every variant is less potent. Well, let's hope that really is the case, and not guaranteed. But Big Pharma is making trillions for their shareholders, or certainly billions. And there's no question that Big Pharma, with the testing and the vaccines, is doing very nicely out of this. So, Nigel in London, good afternoon. What are your thoughts on COVID, House of Lords, or whatever?
House of Lords for a very simple reason.
Hi there. We just missed that intro, Nigel. Just say again.
Oh, well, good afternoon. I'm just saying I'm all in favour for keeping the House of Lords for a number of reasons. We've got to bear in mind, of course, that MPs are elected and can be swayed by election votes. The House of Lords are not, and they're appointed. And one of your guests, I think, from the Conservative Party, or I can't remember the young lady's name. I think she was a former Conservative Party member.
Yes, Sophie.
She alluded to say, well, yeah, she said, oh, well, lots of left-wing, there's lots of right-wing members in the House of Lords. Well, of course, there's lots of left-wing lords in the House of Lords, which she forgot to mention.
It's a very good point, actually. In fact, there's a majority who are not Conservative.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, she rather forgot that point. I think for me that the importance is the ability to hold the House of Commons to account. And whilst we may not like everything they do, we don't necessarily like everything our elected MPs do. So for me, that's a bit of a gravy train of 300 quid a day and a nice red leather chair and lots of lovely restaurants and bars in there. But the point is, for me, I would keep it. I mean, what would you replace it with?
Well, in a sense, that's the big debate, Nigel. So, do you think that even at 800 plus peers, and given that the way they're appointed, which is basically a pure matter of patronage, and as the Sunday Times report before Christmas showed, in a sense, you can almost donate your way to having a very good chance of becoming a peer. Does that not concern you, or do you think that that's an acceptable price to get a bit of expertise in there?
I think it's a great headline-grabbing statement, what you've just said, and I don't necessarily want to undermine it, but one could argue lots are put in there for what they've done. A good example, Baroness Doreen Lawrence. She was put in there because of what she's suffered and how she's campaigning for equality. There are lots of cases which don't fall into the criteria which you've suggested. But I think what I would do is, if I was in charge of the register for the House of Lords, I would have like a bit of a schoolboy, school, my old days, school now, a school register that if you don't attend for a certain number of days a year, then you are warned that you could lose your peerage or will not be admitted anymore. That's what I would do.
That's an interesting thought, because there are a lot of people who actually don't rock up at all. They just bank the title, the kudos, the prestige, and then never give of their wisdom and their knowledge and their expertise.
Exactly right. I may even go and buy myself a lordship for a few hundred quid, but of course it won't allow me to get into the House of Lords. But I may just do it anyway.
Nigel, thank you for that. Fascinating. We've got Stephen also in London. Stephen, good afternoon. Are you with Nigel on the House of Lords reform, or did you want to say something else?
Good afternoon, Richard. Well, I'm in agreement with you that we need to fill the House of Lords of local representatives. I disagree with you that there should also be experts. I mean, the whole idea of democracy is based on ordinary lay people choosing policy, not experts choosing policy. Experts should be there to help implement a policy that has been elected on by the people, but experts should not be deciding on.
I may have just lost you there, Stephen. We'll just see if we can get you back. But I think what you're saying is that you'd like a smaller House of Lords of locally elected representatives from regions, from counties, but not actually have any directly appointed experts. Is that right, Stephen?
Yeah, no, I said I agree with you that there should be more local representation in the House of Lords, but I disagree with you regarding there should be experts in the House of Lords. The idea of democracy is based on ordinary lay people voting on policy. Experts should not be voting on policy. Experts should be there to help implement policy that has been voted on by the lay people of the country.
And what sort of size of House of Lords would you like? Bearing in mind there's over 800 at the moment. And I'm not sure, well, obviously some of them you'd call lay people, but many of them, of course, have come from very successful or privileged backgrounds.
Really don't know, I have a view on the size, but 800 does seem a lot. What are there, 350 or something MPs, is it? I don't know.
We've got 650 MPs, and the size of the House of Lords, it's the second biggest chamber in the world behind the Chinese National Congress, which is hardly a fine democratic institution in itself, is it?
Well, I would say that, like anything, the larger the sample you have, the more... Hello?
Yeah, keep going, Stephen.
The larger the sample you have, the more representation you have. So I don't think there's a problem in that sense, apart from the cost of it all, of course.
Yeah, the cost goes up, that's right. OK, Stephen, thank you very much for your thoughts on House of Lords. Stephen wants elected as opposed to appointed second chamber, but seems to want a much larger chamber than perhaps I would have. Anyway, coming up, we're going to be talking to Brian Monteith, former MEP, about his thoughts on Scotland, about House of Lords reform and other things. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 3, I'm Anila Dami. Lateral flows and PCRs are unavailable in England as pharmacies blame the supply chain. And warnings from the Prime Minister that up to 90% of COVID patients in intensive care have not been boosted. Pharmacists are calling for urgent action to improve the supply of COVID tests as lateral flow home deliveries and PCR appointments become unavailable across the whole of England. Chemists are also having to turn people away empty-handed due to what they're calling low and inconsistent supplies. Yesterday, a record 117,000 cases were recorded in England. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says up to 90% of people who are in intensive care with COVID are not boosted. Boris Johnson said there are 2.4 million eligible double-jabbed people yet to take up the offer of a third dose, and praised those who have had their third jab.
We've done about 32.5, maybe more, million booster jabs now. And that is allowing us to go ahead with New Year in the cautious way that we are.
An investigation by the Met Police has revealed that Insulate Britain's road blocking protests cost the British taxpayer £4.3 million between September and November. More than 6,000 officers were deployed, and at one point there were staff at every junction on the M25 in an attempt to stop the demonstrations. And the coldest US state, Alaska, is experiencing an unprecedented warm spell this winter as daytime temperatures soar to above 15 degrees Celsius. The region saw torrential rain rather than the usual snow. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Standing up, speaking out. Richard Tice. Powered by Debate.
Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Richard Tice. A man of impeccable pedigree.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are in the final hour here at Talk Radio. It is still unbelievably grim outside, but we've got some fun tweets coming in. One here from Josephine. Come back soon, Mike Graham, please. There we go. Mike will be delighted to have heard that one. Well, we've been talking about the COVID restrictions, in particular what's going on in Wales and indeed Scotland relative to the Prime Minister deciding that actually in England we didn't need more restrictions. And it can be fascinating to see what happens in Scotland, whether or not they, after the new year, whether they ease the restrictions. Even just there on the news, you're just hearing Nicola Sturgeon beginning to perhaps soft pedal, backpedal a little bit on the state of the reality of the Omicron crisis and what's going to happen. In a sense, she's been so focused on the cases, and I don't think being really focused actually on what really matters, which are the numbers in ICU and the deaths, of course. So anyway, we're going to be talking to Brian Monteith, former MEP and indeed a former MSP, about his thoughts on this and on House of Lords. And I'm hoping we've got Brian with us now. Brian, a very good afternoon. Happy festive season to you. So Nicola Sturgeon, I know she's not one of you're not a huge fan of hers, but she really has gone overboard with these restrictions compared to England during this festive period. Given where the data is going, how do you think she's going to soft pedal her way out of this?
Well, I thought Nicola Sturgeon's statement in the virtual reconvened Scottish Parliament today was actually very measured. I thought it was quite clever. It was essentially an attempt to look considerate, to say she's weighing up all the options, that she's looking at more data. She's considering how quickly she can maybe change the introduction of regulations she brought last week, but she's not going to concede anything yet. And this is part of, and call me a cynic, this is part of looking different from Boris Johnson. This is part of trying to show that she is far more on top of her brief, far more in charge of detail, that Scotland has a different government from the rest of the UK, and it's important that it is recognised she's in charge. Now, that's actually quite clever politics, and that's why she is where she is, and that's why she keeps winning elections. She comes over as very self-assured. She does not bumble along. She's in command of her language. She's very measured. And she does, for much of the time, if she doesn't get irritated and indifferent to the questions that are put to her, seem actually at times compassionate. But
yes, I mean,
this is, in fact, of course, to me anyway, and to many that follow her, not really the truth. Because the truth is that we know the number one priority is not COVID, it's not education, it's not anything else. It is secession, it is breaking up Britain. And so long as you remember that and are not seduced and forget that, then you can understand what she's saying. And I think she realizes she made a mistake last week because Boris Johnson didn't go down the route of being more regulatory, and that she now is actually looking to find ways out.
Well, essentially,
and what she will do is, therefore, I think she will make changes.
I mean, essentially, she always likes to be one step ahead of Boris or one step different from Boris. And in a sense, over the COVID crisis, sometimes she has looked assured. But where do you think the mood of the Scottish people is now, given what they're seeing in England, given how they're seeing their own New Year's Eve celebrations, Hogmanay being essentially cancelled, more restrictions on businesses, the hospitality sector? Are people getting a bit fed up, or are they continually just accepting that assurance, that calm, diligent approach, that aura that she pervades?
I think she misread the room last week, so to speak, and the evidence for this and the trajectory that she had already started to lose the consent of public support could be seen, especially at football matches. The remaining football matches that were being played before the introduction of the restrictions about crowd size and effectively limiting it to 500 sitting or standing outside in a stadium, resulted in Aberdeen fans at Aberdeen Hibs match making chants about not just where Nicola Sturgeon could go, but what should happen to the booster and where it should go. And that's actually a significant fail for the First Minister, because it's one thing to be unpopular, but when you're making decisions that actually work against what she considers to be in the interests of public health, and therefore people are saying you can stick your booster, then she has actually lost support. And it wasn't just at that football game. It was at other football matches, and in particular to find Celtic supporters who are thought generally to be the most disposed towards Nicola Sturgeon. Celtic supporters not just shouting chants at a match, but protesting with flares and banners afterwards, shows the degree to which she is actually in real danger of losing votes. The problem about this, in a sense, for supporters of the UK, is that you might argue a lot of these people don't actually trouble themselves to go and vote.
Well, that's interesting. And of course, I wonder whether also she's looking for more cash, more money from Westminster, whether or not that comes from the Chancellor. And if it doesn't, of course, then she will use that as another reason to say, Westminster isn't looking after Scotland. We've had all these challenges, all these problems. We're being abandoned, and therefore we should be independent.
That is, of course, a road she could go down. That we don't have the borrowing powers. That we only get Barnett consequentials, the feeding of money to the Scottish Parliament and indeed to the Welsh Parliament and to Stormont too, if there is more UK spending in England. For people who don't know what the Barnett consequential is. So if health spending goes up, generally it means more money is sent to these parliaments and administrations as a result. Now, she can't borrow, she says. She can borrow, but maybe not on what she wants to spend in current account spending to give business relief.
They're pretty good.
And she can't. Well, let me finish, Richard. She can't get Barnett consequentials if there's no increase in spend in the rest of the UK. But she can raise taxes. If she wants to take responsibility for the consequences of what she actually is doing, what she's imposing, she can raise taxes in Scotland. She has those powers. And so what the truth of it is that she doesn't want independence. She doesn't want to secede. She wants the gravy train of money going up from Westminster to Edinburgh to pay for all her decisions.
Well,
she's really an
and it's not just the
imposter. And the SNP up to that fact.
Well, one of the things they need to face up to is the cost of their energy policies. And it's interesting to note that in her official residence, Bute House, in order to transform that from being heated with gas to heated with electricity, it seems that the cost just for one home is some £800,000 of taxpayers' cash in order to virtual signal that you've moved the official residence from gas to electric. She seems pretty good at spending taxpayers' money, and in many cases, actually English taxpayers' money.
Well, I think a number of things are going to come home to roost because there are a number of these studies being carried out. This is a fine Adam Georgian building in Edinburgh, and it would take a great deal of money, I'm sure, to convert it. It's already had recently nearly £1.5 million spent on it to renovate it. But this is just a typical of what actually, on a smaller scale, ordinary residents are going to face with any conversions or alterations to their own bungalows, to their own apartments, to their own villas or semi-detached. All these houses, although invariably smaller, will have significant costs. And the trouble about the green agenda for many people who actually even might support it is that they don't know how much it will cost them. Well, and if they were to be presented with a bill, I think that would shock them immensely.
There's no question, Brian. I think we all want to do our bit, but I think that Nicola's bit in terms of energy policies, in the same way that Boris's bit, it's the wrong bit at the wrong price in the wrong timeline. We're slightly struggling with the connection there, Brian, but thank you so much for your thoughts there on Nicola Sturgeon, how she's going to extract herself from the restrictions in Scotland, and the politicking behind how she always wants to be a little bit different from Boris Johnson. That was Brian Monteith, former MSP and also former MEP. Coming up, we're going to be talking to Ray Jones about the social care report that came out this morning. Stay with us. It's 3:14. It's Tice Talk here on Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV weather.
This is your weather on Talk Radio TV. Warm and windy for the rest of the day. Earlier rain will clear, giving way to a dry afternoon with some sunny spells and staying nice and mild this evening. Now, looking across the UK, it'll be dry for southern and central areas with some sunshine poking through, but further north, heavy rain will continue for parts of Scotland. Staying warm as we move into the evening, and some rain will set in and move northwards across England and Wales. Stay with us for more weather updates here on Talk Radio TV.
A radiant force of argument.
Shape up and talk.
Freedom of speech. Accept no substitutes.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. We're in the third hour. We've just been listening to Brian Monteith about his thoughts about Scotland. And also just going back to Wales, unbelievably, the Welsh government, talk about cancelling people's fun even when it's outdoors. They've cancelled all of the park runs that are so good for people's health, for their fitness, and yet because of the COVID restrictions, their complete overreaction, yes, they've cancelled the right for people to run outdoors. Unbelievable, quite unbelievable. Well, we're going to have a change of tack now because there's a new report out today by the Commission on Young Lives report, which was produced by the Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, which is quite shocking in its key findings. Essentially, that teenagers that are taken into care in England to safeguard them from exploitation are actually be putting more at risk, at serious risk, in the care system itself than what it was trying to protect them for. And it said that actually children being moved from their local areas to live in unregulated accommodation are often ending up being targeted by criminals. Really shocking. I'm delighted to be joined by Ray Jones, Professor of Social Work at Kingston University and at St George's, University of London, and himself a registered social worker. Ray, a very good afternoon to you, and thanks for joining us. So this report, I think for anybody that looks at it, that looks at the summary, just feels extraordinary. You wonder how we could get into a state where, in a sense, in trying to protect children that need safeguarding, you end up making their situation worse.
Well, the report from Anne Longfield, she's the former Children's Commissioner for England, is spot on. And it's got worse over the last 10 years. And children are now being placed, and I say children, young people are now being placed in unregulated accommodation, away from their families, away from their communities. And big profits are being made of this by the commercial companies and private owners who are providing this accommodation. This is not the position we had 10 years ago, but we're now in a position where there's a real crisis and children are left very vulnerable.
So how have we arrived at this relative to 10 years ago? Are you saying that this whole process is outsourced to private companies and therefore that there isn't the supervision, the checking and the double checking?
Yeah, well, if we go back 10, 15 years, most local authorities, most local councils ran their own children's homes. When children and young people came into care, they were placed locally. Social workers and their managers knew the children's homes, knew who was in them, knew who was working within them, were frequent visitors to these children's homes. What's happened over the last 10 years is that we've seen an increasing privatisation and commercialisation of children's social care. Over 80% of children's homes are now provided by profit-making commercial companies, often owned by international venture capitalists. They're taking big profits, over £250 million a year, out of these children's homes. They build the children's homes or adopt properties for the children's homes in areas of low-cost housing, often with unstable and migratory populations. So we've actually gone to a position where we've moved away from local provision by local authorities into a privatised marketplace, which has left children very vulnerable.
And has it been compounded by the COVID crisis and therefore the challenges of getting appropriate supervision to make sure that people are not being abused or targeted by criminals?
Well, it's been compounded by the COVID crisis. It's more difficult to find out what's happening to young people if you're not having direct contact with them. If you're trying to maintain contact by, for example, phone or by iPad, that's not actually getting to see what's happening for these children. And the whole thrust towards moving away from the public sector provision of children's homes within local communities where The children are seen by people who know them. They can go to the same schools. They can be in contact with their social workers regularly, to children being placed 50, 100, 200 miles away in a private, unregulated accommodation. It's a disaster.
I must say, I hadn't appreciated the extent to which you're referring to of outsourcing to, to private profit-making companies, venture capital-backed groups providing this care. Is there much being done by charities of this care work, or actually has it gone straight from local authorities to private enterprise?
Well, a lot of the big charities, Barnardo's, what used to be called NCH, Action for Children, the Children's Society, they moved out of providing residential care for children in the 1980s and 1990s, when the thrust was towards helping more children back within their families through family centres, Sure Start, etc. And local authorities started moving out of the direct provision when the message from the government from 2010 onwards was that the private sector was the answer. Local authorities should not be providing this care themselves. And it's been a very quick transition that's left us in the position we're in today.
And then if you look at, for example, the tragic death of Arthur Labinjo Hughes, essentially, I mean, does it show that the whole system needs massive reform? For younger children, it is still, as I understand, care workers employed by local authorities. But it just seems time and time again that there are massive failings in the system that are allowed to go unchecked, unsupervised. What's the regulatory sort of provision to check on this, to make sure, to try and stop this happening time and again?
Well, the regulator, the inspector, is Ofsted, and Ofsted inspects local authorities, does it regularly. And the difficulty that we've had is since 2010, local authorities providing statutory children's social care, child protection services, etc., have had a 60% cut in their funding. We now have fewer health visitors. We now have fewer community police officers. We now have social workers closing work down very quickly to take new work on. They're often being removed from their communities to central locations to save on office costs, etc. Any way we can make savings, we're making savings. But it means that we're actually not doing the job we need to be doing out there in communities, finding what's happening for young children within families and also for older children without in the community.
It does seem a complete failure. I wonder whether Ofsted actually is the right regulator. I mean, they're pretty busy looking after mainstream schools. Surely it needs a completely separate, more focused control and supervision mechanism. Otherwise, this just goes on. And every time people wring their hands when there's a disaster, but there never seems to be any actual real lasting reforming change.
Well, the reforming change we need is reinvestment. You can't do the job that we need to do, protecting children, helping children within families, caring for children outside of families when that's necessary, if you don't have the time to do it. And the time means having the workers on the ground to do it. If you reduce that workforce, and that workforce is not only social workers, it's community police officers, health visitors, community paediatricians, etc., Sure Start family centres. If you cut all of those out or make them so minimised that they're running ragged, then we're not doing the job we need to do. We need reform, but the reform is reinvestment, and we need to move back from the privatisation and with big profits being taken out of children's services with a bit of money that's left.
And it's interesting because in the report it also refers that actually black children are more likely to be in care, and that therefore there may be an inbuilt racial bias in the system. And the Department of Education says it's urgently reforming the system. It talks about investing more money, but I guess your concern is that money is just being invested back in the private providers of the homes, of the places.
Well, it's investing a few million back into the services, but it's taken billions of pounds out of the services over the last 10 years. And as I say, that thrust towards privatisation is leaking money out of the little bit of money that's left as well as profits. And for black children, and there's two reasons, I think, why there's a disproportionate number of black children in care. Often black children live within deprived communities, areas which are poorer, and it's harder to care well for your children if you yourself are struggling in terms of families. But the other bit is, I'm sure there is some racial bias within it, right across all the services. So two reasons, but underneath it all, if you cut the funding in the way it's been cut, if you privatise services and centralise them in the way they're being managed at the moment, then we do not do the job we need to be doing.
So your preference would be to see more operation of these homes being taken back to local authorities or being taken back to the charitable sector, which can actually do a fantastic job, still be well regulated, but also perhaps more efficient in terms of provision than some of the less well-run local authorities?
Well, my preference would be to have the homes provided locally, close to the communities where the children come from, and without profit being taken out. That can be managed in two ways. One is by having the local authorities doing it themselves and having that accountability. The other is them partnering with voluntary organisations. That's not what we're doing at the moment. Neither of those solutions are the solutions that are being proposed at the moment. What's being proposed at the moment is more privatisation.
So that, in a sense, that sounds like it's, from what you're saying, that's ideological from the government to perhaps increase a bit of investment, but to continue down the current process of having outsourced private profit-making providers.
Yes, and what's happened over the last 10 years is that we've made it very difficult for local authorities to do the job they need to do. We've made it very difficult for them to partner with voluntary organisations, with the charities, because they need the funding from local authorities. What's happening instead is the private sector, commercial organisations have come into this place, dominate the market now, and because they dominate the market, they're able to charge almost whatever they choose to charge. And children are being placed miles and miles away at a high cost, and it's not a good solution to what we need to be doing.
It sounds as though significant reform is required, and that this report is a massive wake-up call. Ray, thank you so much for those thoughts. Quite shocking. That was Ray Jones, Emeritus Professor of Social Work at Kingston University, himself a registered social worker. A real eye-opener as to some of the challenges that are being faced, and also how actually young children of all ages are being let down by the system. Coming up, we're going to be taking your calls and your tweets, your messages. Keep them coming. 0344 499 1000. Where are you on the COVID restrictions? Where are you on House of Lords reform? Anything else you want to say? And then we'll also be talking to Willie Rennie, Liberal Democrat MSP, talking about Scotland's restrictions and that extraordinary £800,000 bill for Nicola Sturgeon's official residence. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Anila Dami. Lateral flows and PCRs are unavailable in England as pharmacies blame the supply chain. And warnings from the Prime Minister that up to 90% of COVID patients in intensive care have not been boosted. Pharmacists are calling for urgent action to improve the supply of COVID tests as lateral flow home deliveries and PCR appointments become unavailable across the whole of England. Chemists are also having to turn people away empty-handed due to what they're calling low and inconsistent supplies. Yesterday, a record 117,000 cases were recorded in England. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says up to 90% of people who are in intensive care with COVID are not boosted. Boris Johnson said there are 2.4 million eligible double-jabbed people yet to take up the offer of a third dose, and praised those who have had their third jab.
We've done about 32.5, maybe more, million booster jabs now. And that is allowing us to go ahead with New Year in the cautious way that we are.
An investigation by the Met Police has revealed that Insulate Britain's road-blocking protests cost the British taxpayer £4.3 million between September and November. More than 6,000 officers were deployed, and at one point there were staff at every junction on the M25 in an attempt to stop the demonstrations. And the coldest US state, Alaska, is experiencing an unprecedented warm spell this winter as daytime temperatures soar to above 15 degrees Celsius. The region saw torrential rain rather than the usual snow. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Talk Radio. More taste, more flavour.
Reach for the story.
More outspoken.
Error 5092. Argument failed to start.
Talk Radio.
There's still a good argument for listening.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are approaching the end of the show, but not before we've got time to go back up to Scotland to find out some latest views from a Scottish Liberal Democrat MSP, Willie Rennie, who's the MSP for North East Fife, and very interested in his thoughts on Nicola Sturgeon's latest speech today and the COVID restrictions. Willie, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining me, having just left. I think you've just come out of the chamber. So what are your thoughts on the First Minister's latest announcement on the restrictions? Obviously, you've got far tighter restrictions than here in England, and it seems that she's keeping them going through until at least January the 17th. Is that right?
Well, yeah, there's nothing much changed today. I'm not quite sure why we were recalled, because she didn't have an awful lot to say other than what she's told us before. I actually believe that people are generally listening to the scientists like Chris Whitty rather than the politicians, which is why we're probably not seeing as big a difference north and south of the border as you would perhaps imagine with the difference that exists in the restrictions. So yeah, there wasn't much new today. I do have a concern that the self-isolation difference north and south of the border is having a real impact on critical services like care at home, which is on its knees in Scotland. Vulnerable people are going without essential care right now because there is a massive shortage of staffing. Now, I am as cautious as the next man about all of this because I've seen the devastation this virus has caused. But I do hope we're getting the right advice to Nicola Sturgeon about this self-isolation, because the price that is being paid, for instance, with care at home is astonishing.
Which sounds horrific. And just to remind listeners, the isolation rules in Scotland are still at 10 days. That's right, I believe, Willie, as opposed to in England, it's at 7 days.
But it's not just that difference, Richard. There's a difference in the people that are covered. So if somebody in your house tests positive, in England, you just have to prove that you're negative. In Scotland, you have to self-isolate as well for 10 days. And in addition to that, those who you come in contact with outside your household, if they've not been double vaccinated, they have to self-isolate as well. So it's a massively increased pool of people that have to self-isolate. Now, if this virus is going to spread around unnoticed and it's going to cause devastation, I think that policy is sensible. But that's why I hope we're getting the right advice to the First Minister, because I do worry about the devastating impact it's having on things like care at home.
But that is a massive difference when you include that much broader pool that you've just referred to. But actually, given that all of the data across the UK clearly indicates that Omicron is milder in terms of the severity of its impact, albeit much more transmissible, and that the number of people in ICU or sadly dying is broadly stable, or indeed in some cases reducing. Do you think that there's sort of an appetite for a debate about reducing that isolation, or actually do you think that she's got her view and she's going to stick with it through until the 17th?
To be honest, I don't know. I've given up reading her mind, so I'm not quite sure exactly when she'll change this. I think it is coming. I want to be cautious. I've been cautious throughout this pandemic, but it's not just a one-sided argument. There are multitude of harms that we need to consider. You know, the care one I've just talked about, education, economic, as well as the virus. So I just want to be absolutely sure that we're not being cavalier with the restrictions that the First Minister has put in place on the self-isolation, because I want to make sure that other people in the community don't suffer because of the side effects of this.
Of course, because the collateral damage is so profound, so deep in so many ways. And I think that my view is actually for a very long time that hasn't been properly taken into account when considering restrictions. And of course, you've got we've got vaccine passports in England. You've got them in Scotland, and the Liberal Democrat view in Westminster is against vaccine passports. Are you as amongst the Lib Dem MSPs also against them, or do you have a different view on that?
Yeah, they're utterly pointless. utterly pointless. I mean, I have got an ideological opposition to them because I believe in controlling the state and making sure it doesn't have too much interference in our lives. So I have an ideological opposition to them. But they're utterly useless. She doesn't talk about them anymore. They're not even mentioned in the statement today. They were the big saviour, just a few weeks ago. But we know that actually it doesn't prove that you've not got the virus.
Absolutely, I agree entirely.
What it does is it shows that you're perhaps a little bit more protected. You can still be spreading it around, though. So they're utterly pointless. Utterly. It's just an example of being seen to be doing something rather than choosing something that is effective. I want to be cautious. I've emphasised throughout this interview that I want to be cautious. But I want to do things that work, not things that are pointless.
Absolutely. And there have been so many interventions, and I agree with you. And it's a fantastic way to finish, Willie. Vaccine passports, utterly pointless. There's no evidence they've made any difference, not only just here in some of the devolved nations, but actually in some of the other countries where they've been used, in particular across Europe, for example. Willie, thank you so much for that. Have a very happy new year, and look forward to speaking in 2022 and the challenges that we all face next year. Thank you very much. That was Willie Rennie, the Liberal Democrat MSP for North East 5. Fascinating, his thoughts about Nicola Sturgeon. He's given up reading her mind. But talking about reading people's minds, well, a major moment, because, of course, we have now looking forward to the next 3 hours here in Talk Radio, where you're going to be entertained royally, joyfully by Christo, who is just...
I'm not sure I'd call it joyfully.
Oh, I think so. I think we have to be optimistic. How are you, Christo?
We are showing some optimism, though we will be trying to explore why Boris Johnson isn't now cutting the isolation time when it comes to COVID, bearing in mind that Omicron is the dominant strain, and it does appear... We were right all along that it is.
Well, was there any doubt?
Well, I mean, a lot of doctors we spoke to 2 doctors yesterday who were pro-original lockdown, who are even saying now, actually, you know what, maybe we all jumped the gun on Omicron.
And we've been talking, fascinating, how the tone has changed in the last 36 hours.
It really has. And let's not mistake us as well, and I will keep making this point till I am blue in the face, Boris Johnson saved his own skin. He didn't do anything to save our skin. He didn't bring in extra restrictions to save his own skin.
From his own backbenchers.
From his own backbenchers. So we're going to talk to Dr. Sarah Jarvis about that. We're also going to cross live once again. People really seem to appreciate when we cross live to South Africa and find out exactly what is still happening there, what they think about the fact that there are other nations in the UK that have these tighter restrictions. And so we're going to do that again today. We're going to speak to Ray White from Eyewitness News, someone we spoke to
it
last
is fascinating
week.
Because they've got, they're ahead of the game on us, and they seem to have dealt with the Omicron crisis much better than we have.
And they are quite bemused by how we're being. And I think we've shown a real arrogance towards South Africa, actually, in the way in which we've just dismissed their data, saying we want our own, and now what's happening here is completely mirroring what happened there. We'll talk to Donica McCarthy. It's always an interesting exchange between myself and him about the fact that Insulate Britain, the policing of that absolute farce, cost £4.3 million. How many houses could that have insulated?
Apparently 3,500 is what I read.
Well, we will put that to him. We're going to talk to my political panel, as always. We'll get a live reaction to the latest Omicron figures. Much more. Oh, and the year recording in showbiz as well. The year in showbiz.
You'll need 4 hours, not 3 hours to fit all that in, Christo. That's absolutely outstanding. Don't go anywhere. That is a fantastic show lined up with Christo. Thanks for being with us. We've been pretty busy ourselves, thanks to my great production team, as I've been standing in here for Ian Collins. And I'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock again to talk about the latest views, the latest thoughts. Stay with us. Thanks very much for listening. And coming up after the news, we have, of course, got the one and only, yes, it's Christo, here at Talk Radio. Stay with us.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.